When you want to work and live in a different country to where you're employed, there's 4 things you need to get right, and this is going to tell you what those things are. The right to live and work in a different country isn't automatic, and even if you're remote working and you're not employed in that country, it's important to check the employment status there and make sure that you have the right paperwork to be allowed to live there. Work permits and visas are easy to obtain, or it's a known and standard framework if you have an employer there. But when your employer's in one country and you're choosing to work on a beach in a different country, then you need to look very carefully about whether you're even allowed to be in that country, and specifically if you're allowed to work in that country. Because immigration law is designed to make sure you don't take jobs from somebody that already lives there. Nobody's going to be answering your emails for you while you're there, but then the law isn't always consistent with the way business works these days. So checking your immigration status is very important. Now, for Europeans within the EU, you've always got that right to free movement. But once you go to different countries, it's very, very important to check, because breach of immigration law is often criminal and you can get locked up severely, and you really wouldn't want that to happen. Some jobs are very difficult to actually fit within an immigration legislation framework, because if you are self-employed and you're an influencer or a podcaster and you just go places and make content while you're there, then it's very difficult to differentiate where work starts and stops. And you do see some countries that are tightening up at the moment. If someone's there to just shoot a bit of content, they may turn you back at the border and say, you're actually coming here to work within the meaning of the immigration legislation. So if you don't have the right paperwork, you're not coming in. And I've seen people turned away in the US recently for this in a way that wouldn't have happened maybe a few years back. So always be careful, because you just never know what rabbit hole you're taking yourself down once you're having a conversation with an immigration official at the airport. The way to deal with that is just to be clear what your rights and obligations are. If countries have a digital nomad or remote working visa, if you can get one of those, there's about 50 or 60 countries that do. If you've got that bit of paperwork first, then you're much clearer than if you've just sort of winged it and said, oh, I'll be okay. So just check there's enough resources online to do that. And just be sure that the country you're going to wants you there. I mean, you're going to be there and spending money, but that isn't always a good enough reason to do that. Tax is obviously my favourite subject here, but that's why we didn't do it first, just to give me a chance to talk about other things too. But when you're employed in one country, your employer often assumes that you're on the payroll there, they're withholding tax and social security in that country, but you're actually living and working in another one. And at some point, if you're there long enough, the tax authorities in that country actually have the right to tax you first rather than the country where your legal employment is. So understanding what those thresholds are, whether it's in terms of number of days, whether it's the sort of permanence of your role there, whether it's where you're actually living or where you're just passing through, those kind of centres of vital interest, as we call it in the double tax agreement, really, really determine where you're going to be taxed. It's not only the question of the number of days. If you do go over 183 days, which is half a year, then typically most countries will start to be interested in you and say that you should be being taxed from that point. But other than that, there are other facts and circumstances too. Now, if you go from one place to another, it's relatively easy, because if you're not there long enough that they'll ever know anything about you, that is not a reason to not pay tax, unfortunately. If you're just remote working part-time and you've got your nexus back to your main country, you may just stay taxable there, and that's fine. Then you just spend 2 or 3 months once or twice a year in other locations and go back home. Then you stay taxable in your home country. If you then go from place to place to place, if you've tried to tell your home country you're no longer taxable there, then it increases the risk that the other country's got the right to tax you, because the double tax agreement that would stop you being taxed in that short circumstance no longer applies if you've ceased residency in your home country. So being itinerant and spending 3 months in one place and 3 months in another place and 3 months in another place, technically each of those countries has the right to tax you for those 3 months. Practically, the process to do that may be very, very complex, and you may be gone long before the tax return is due. But if you want to go back and they know you've been there, you've got to be careful. Now, I think it's important just to keep track of the number of days you're in each country, look at where you're paid from, and making it clear in your own mind whether you've stayed tax resident in your original country or not, because if you haven't, then you will then potentially be more likely to be over the threshold to be taxable in the country you're remote working from. Now, if you're going from place to place, it's a very, very different circumstance to if you're in one-time remote working. And it's where we see you need to get it really set up right is if you're working in Spain remotely for a company based in the UK, which is a scenario I see an awful lot, then you've got to be clear in both countries and have a tax advisor in each country to make sure you stay in line with the law, because the country where you're living does have the right to tax you, even if your employer is somewhere else. So you need to get that right. Now, when you're employed, Social Security is the other thing that they take out of your payslip in addition to tax. And the rules for Social Security and tax are similar enough but different enough that you need to address them separately. So typically, Social Security is a two-way bargain you have with the government. With tax, they just take your money. With Social Security, they take your money and they've assumed certain obligations to you in return in terms of whether it's pension or unemployment benefits, sickness benefits, or healthcare. Each country is slightly different. So you're making a contribution, but in return, you're accruing some rights. So if you're within the EU, then there's a directive that says if you're going somewhere for less than 2 years and you're posted there, you have the right to stay in your home country system, because they just don't want people accruing small levels of rights in each individual country because it gets too messy. So then you need to get a certificate of coverage in your home country to then say that you're allowed to stay in that country system. That means you can show that Social Security authorities in the other country, and that way you won't need to pay contributions twice. Some of them will ask for it, many of them will ask for it, so it's always worth getting that sorted out and agreed with your employer before you go. Now, if you're not posted, if you are remote working, you can also get one of those as a multi-state worker, as it's called. So investigate that one if that works for you as well, if that meets your fact pattern. Now, these things are only valid for up to 2 years, and if you end up settling somewhere and you end up being a remote worker that's in the same location, then ultimately you will need to look at what your obligations are in that country. And then it can get messy, because if your employer's in one country and you're in the other, they may have to then do some kind of payroll registration to make sure the contributions get paid, and they may then have an opinion as to whether they should be incurring that cost on your behalf or not. So the question I often get asked is, should I tell my employer that I'm working in another country? And the answer is always yes, but you need to think carefully about what the consequences of those are. Little things like, is the employer's insurance liability coverage valid if you're working somewhere else? If you're working from home, have you got the right desk space and chair space to comply with their health and safety obligations? And are those different in the country you're in rather than the country you're from? Employers often get concerned if they find that someone's in another country, because they could inadvertently create corporate tax liability for the company. If you are seeing customers in that country and generating revenue and sales in that country, and the employer could actually be then subject to corporation tax on those, with an issue called permanent establishment. So if there is a fixed place of the business in which the management, the enterprise is carried out, the employer could actually have a corporate tax liability. Now, in the majority of cases, for people that aren't in revenue generating roles, this is not ultimately going to be a problem. But it's always a question that will get raised, and always a question that needs to be addressed. But I've also seen it said, we can't do that because there's a permanent establishment, to which my response is always yes. And if there is, what is the consequence of that? Because it may be that something is there, but it may be that the tax cost of that at the company level isn't so great. Now, if you're there long enough, we talked already about Social Security and also income tax, you may find that the employer technically has a payroll withholding obligation on employees in that country. So if you may be somewhere long enough, they may then have to register, and they may not want to do that. There may be a cost associated with that. And if they haven't done that, they may be exposed to risks and penalties. And that is why you often see, in practice, larger companies saying you can work remotely in different countries, but only up to 30 or 60 days a year, because they just don't want to deal with these costs. And so it's very important that you sort of look at that and work within that framework. And of course, if you choose to go ahead, beyond that, then clearly you're in breach of your employment contract if you're not careful. So think twice about that. And yes, How will they ever know? Trying to log on from your firm laptop will tell you the IP address of where you're logging on from. Putting a VPN on your laptop to get around that will often not work because most employers won't let you put VPNs on their firm laptops, or they will spot if you have done. So, with the right level of communication and the right level of transparency, we see this work in practice for an awful lot of companies. And it's a great way to keep your employees happy and keep them motivated and deal with employee retention, because if someone is moving somewhere, say because their spouse has a job there, if you can keep that person and then keep them employed and then have them back when they return, you're probably better off than training a replacement. But it's a broader conversation. You can do it, but you've got to just make sure you've considered all the issues: immigration, tax, social security, and the employer's aspects of it, for it to work really successfully. But it can do. So those are the 4 things that you needed to know, and now you know them. So if you want to talk about it more, the links are in the description below, and then we can chat through what might work for you. And if you want to go and talk to your employer about it, let's have a chat first, and then let's have a chat with them as well and see if we can make it work.